It's a bit like the kind of old Zen joke of a student going to the teacher and saying, how long will it take me to get enlightened? And the teacher says, 10 years. And the student says, what if I try really hard? And the teacher says, 20 years. So we're kind of, letting go of trying and dropping into allowing. So acceptance is really key.
Welcome to The Art of Quality in Attention, a podcast that explores the ways in which master practitioners attend to their craft. The quality of attention plays a huge role in how we perceive and experience the world. By exploring how master practitioners pay attention in the context of their work, we hope to shed light on the inner game of seeking quality in work and life. I'm your host, William Oliver. Our guest on this episode of The Art of Quality in Attention is Ed Halliwell. Ed is a mindfulness teacher and author with over 20 years' experience leading public mindfulness courses, workshops and retreats. He's introduced and taught mindfulness in workplaces from Accenture to the Houses of Parliament and UNICEF UK. His books include Into the Heart of Mindfulness and Mindfulness: How to Live Well by Paying Attention. I first met Ed at an event at the School of Life in London in 2014. I was struck by the quality of his presence and the gentleness of his approach to teaching. My interest in recording this episode with Ed today comes from a deep appreciation of his skill in helping people improve the quality of their capacity to attend to the world around them. About 6 years ago, at the same time as I founded my business, I started working with Ed on a one-to-one basis every week in what Ed would call mindfulness coaching. As Ed describes it, mindfulness coaching can help us unhook from automatic thoughts and behaviour patterns, can help us manage difficulties with more awareness and kindness, can help us make choices that align more deeply with our needs and values, and it can be, in my experience, pretty useful in sustaining a flourishing life through the ongoing practice of paying attention. In our conversation, Ed lays out how the quality of our attention plays a huge and generally underappreciated role in how we perceive the world. If our capacity for observation and attending is degraded by desire, greed or fear, for example, it becomes very difficult to see what's actually going on in the present moment. By wanting things to be a certain way, however subtly, we become distanced from what's actually going on, our observation being clouded by psychological projection. We explored all of this and much more in an episode that I hope you'll enjoy. Ed, welcome to The Art of Quality.
Thank you. Good to be here, Willie.
It's such a joy to spend some time with you today. I've been looking forward to this. We've had conversations about quality for many years now. What do they say about the Tao? That whatever you can name, it's not it. So I think we can keep that thought in the room as we investigate this fascinating topic in the context of paying attention. And I'm just so deeply grateful to have this time with you to explore this question of attention, of quality, and of your experience as someone who's devoted a pretty solid chunk of your life to this question of attention and how we can bring it to bear on our lives, in our lives. So if you have any strong views or any views on this question of quality and attention, I'd love to begin there.
Well, I wonder if I might start just by describing maybe how I kind of entered into this work, because that might provide a little bit of context for people. So my experience in my 20s was that I had a lot of anxiety, and that anxiety led me to kind of flounder in my life. And I was floundering in retrospect largely because I didn't know what to do with my attention. In that my attention tended to wander to disaster scenarios in the head. It wandered to thoughts that would lead me to panic. It would wander to kind of exhortations to make me drive ahead in ways that weren't particularly good for my body. It was quite judging, kind of this voice in my head that would kind of snag my attention. And so there would be a kind of a continual sort of, what I sometimes call now like like a poisonous parrot, kind of like chattering away in the back of the head and kind of, saying, you're no good. You should do this. You shouldn't do that. You'll never make this work. And so having that going on in the background is one thing. But when our attention is actually with that kind of voice, it made it very difficult to live a fulfilling life. And the key was beginning to recognize that this voice actually wasn't me. Now, of course, in some sense, it is a part of my experience. It was real. It was there. But because my attention was with that voice much of the time, as in there was no separation between my attention and the automatic thoughts that were arising, then for all intents and purposes, that voice was me, because our attention is a faculty that we have to choose how our automatic experience is met. And if our attention automatically goes to those, so the attention automatically going to the automatic thoughts that arise in the mind, then we can be quite stuck. And I was quite stuck. So in that time, I tried many things to try and help. I kind of went to psychotherapy, and I tried lots of kind of, alternative stuff. And I tried changing my job, and I tried changing where I lived, and all of those different things. And actually what really started to make a difference eventually, and this was after kind of, several years of seeking during a period of very high anxiety, what really helped was learning to meditate. And when I first encountered meditation, there was a kind of a light bulb moment. Now, this wasn't that everything suddenly changed. It didn't. But what I realized when I was taught to meditate, but this was the first time that I was being asked to work with my attention, not kind of like what was going on in my life around me, not trying to change the thoughts in my head, and, not trying to kind of fix the problem from a kind of like, for a content point of view, but actually to start to look at attention from a functional point of view, from a context point of view, which is, what is this thing that attaches to our experience? And so what meditation does, if we engage with it, what we do in meditation, is we practice putting our attention somewhere and somehow. So, I was first taught mindfulness of the breath. So very kind of like, traditional practice. And what I discovered when I was invited to put my attention on my breath, first of all, it wouldn't stay there. It would wander straight off into the anxious and anxiety-making thoughts. So that was kind of interesting to discover that actually I found it very challenging to put my attention somewhere that I had chosen. Nevertheless, that in the very short moments where I could place my attention on the breath, when I was sensing the breath, I wasn't completely in those thoughts. It was like they're in the background. So they were still happening, those thoughts, kind of the poisonous parrot kind of going, squawk, squawk, squawk. And yet I wasn't the squawking anymore. I was with the breath briefly until, the attention kind of zapped back. And of course, the kind of invitation in meditation is to notice that zapping back to being caught up with thoughts and to bring the attention back again, in this case, to the breath. Doesn't have to, there's many different meditation practices, but bringing the attention to a particular focus that you have chosen. And so that was the beginning of realizing that there could be some separation between what was going on in my thinking mind, all the words that were happening in my head, and me. That there was a kind of a possibility of being a me that wasn't hooked up in those. And so that really sort of sparked my interest, because it felt like this is different from anything that I've done before. And I'm starting to have an experience of the possibility of a little bit of separation between what was happening up here and where I choose to place my attention. So that kind of was the beginning of realizing that attention was such an important faculty that actually I knew nothing about, really. It was just kind of, my attention just went automatically where it went. And, my school teachers may have said, pay attention at various points, but nobody told me how to do it. So it just was a default thing that went wherever it went. And realizing that it often goes in places that aren't helpful for us as human beings, then might it be valuable to train that faculty? And so that kind of led, this was, 20 plus years ago now that I was first taught to meditate. And that has started a journey of kind of inquiry and investigation and practice that has made significant differences over time.
Would you say the quality of your life has changed as you have practiced?
Well, first of all, I think it's important and kind of real to acknowledge that I continue to carry the parrot with me. Okay, so I'm not about to give you a kind of like a story of never-ending bliss. So because automatic
There's
thoughts.
No park bench. There's no park bench where you sat down, and from that day on, everything changed.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I'm guessing you're referring to Eckhart Tolle here, what I would say is that there are and have been park bench moments, but it hasn't necessarily been a kind of sustained, that's the end of the journey. So certainly there have been many moments of insight and realization in that time where, kind of some kind of understanding of how the mind operates has come in. And then it's been a journey of practice of working with that. And sometimes that's been a really difficult journey. Sometimes it's been a really delightful journey. So I continue to work with those patterns that I experienced all those years ago, kind of. My biology is, presumably much the same. Meditation certainly can change the neural architecture to some degree. So maybe there's been some of that's happened. But it's a bit like with exercise. We are given the bodies that we are given, and we can train them, and we can develop flexibility and strength and so on. But we are working with the limitations of what we are given. So the same is true with the mind, in my experience. However, the possibility of practicing working with automatic thoughts, tendencies towards habitual behavior that maybe doesn't serve us, and the ability that attention gives us to unhook from that and make choices that are not dependent on that automatic activity can be really, really powerful. And I found it really powerful. So in terms of kind of changes in my life, it's enabled me to sustain relationships in a way that I couldn't in the past. It's enabled me to develop a job that I love. And it's enabled me to be present to my family in a way that maybe might not have been possible before. So in terms of kind of making choices about how to live life, it's a bit like a shift from making choices that are based on habit to being based on intention. And, of course, being drawn back again and again into habit. That's kind of part of the path, kind of the habits and the kind of like the wandering of the mind provides us with the resistance that we work with in meditation, a bit like, the resistance that you might find in a weight, kind of in a gym, kind of like when you're doing the bicep curls, kind of you need a weight to develop the strength. So, these habits and patterns of automatic reactivity are not, not so much the enemy. In some sense, they're the weights that can help us continue to develop.
I think I'll paraphrase it. There's a beautiful line from a talk that Ram Dass gives on the mechanics of mind. And he says something to the effect of, I've been meditating for decades and I've taken every psychedelic under the sun in absurd quantities and practiced all these, a vast array of modalities. And I sit here with you today and not a single one of my neuroses is gone. I just am in a very different relationship with them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel that resonates deeply with me, and it seems like that's very much been your experience.
Yeah, it's another thing that Ram Dass said, and I think you may have even told me this, was that he sometimes described his personality as being a bit like a pet, that it was his job, as he saw it, to look after the pet, a bit like you might look after a dog or a cat. Now, no matter how much looking after of a pet you do, the pet's still going to be the animal, so it's still going to, dog's still going to bark, and it's still going to jump up impulsively, and it's still going to chase squirrels or whatever. You can't train a dog, or not very easily anyway, to not do that kind of thing. You perhaps can to some degree, but in the same way, the thinking mind will do the things that thinking mind does. Habit patterns will arise as impulses in the body. And it's our job to look after those, to train them, yes, where that's possible, but recognizing that actually it's about taking care. It's about kind of a compassionate relationship to this experience of being human, which includes all of these habits. It includes all of this kind of distractibility, recognizing that all of these patterns have evolved for good reason. They're protective for us. The scattering of the mind. If the mind didn't scatter, we were focused fully all the time on what we were doing, then we might not notice the predator in the background who wants to eat us. So, the kind of the wandering of the mind and, habit patterns of reactivity, like, fear or anger, the emotions that signal to us what's going on moment by moment. These aren't our enemies. They are, in some circumstances, they are friends. It's just that there are other circumstances where going with them and being kind of enslaved by them doesn't help us. And that's where paying attention can make a difference. So if we can notice, if we can learn to pay attention to what is going on within us, to understand those patterns, and to, as you're suggesting, kind of learn how to relate to them in a different way, then they don't actually need to go away in order for our experience to be a lot happier and healthier.
And it seems a lot more connected. That you mentioned when we were talking about the quality of your life and how things have changed for you over the course of the years. I guess what struck me is your mentioning of the quality of relationships in your life and your ability to have space for those relationships, your ability to, and I wonder if we could explore that in a bit more detail in the context of this question of practice, of paying attention, that it seems that through practice, a spaciousness opens up where we can start to recognize an inherent interrelatedness. The inherent interrelatedness, I go as far as saying the inherent interrelatedness of life, this experience of being part of a whole. It seems to open up a spaciousness, certainly that I hadn't known until a few years ago, and hadn't begun to deepen until we started working together. That's something that feels very striking and really quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned this word spacious, because I make a distinction between attention and awareness. Okay, so attention, when I'm describing attention, I'm speaking about, if you like, the sort of spotlight that our mind can focus on a particular object. So, if you imagine you've got a torch, a flashlight, and you can point that flashlight at different objects in your environment. So you can do this in the outer environment. So now I'm now turning to my right and I can see a grey door, and that becomes the focus of my attention. And I turn to you and I can see you. And I turn to my left and I see a white wall. And so just like shining a torch, you can point that flashlight of attention in certain directions, and that shifts and changes your experience. Now, in the background of that, there's still a lot going on, right? So I might turn to look at the grey door and then have a thought about what a nice door it is. So that thought about the door isn't the door. It's a thought, it's a mental event. Okay, so if I'm also noticing in the background the thought about the door that's arising automatically, and my attention is focused on the door, then what is it that's noticing the thought? So that's where awareness comes in. So it's like awareness is if you like, the kind of like the background space in which everything is experienced. Now that includes what we're paying attention to, but it also includes what's in the background. So I mentioned earlier that, I was taught mindfulness of breath, but we can also attend with kind of like a wider sense. So we can also kind of like, from that torchlight of attention, we can open up the flashlight, almost like it becomes a floodlight, and then kind of rest in this spaciousness that includes all of our experience. Now that could be all of our inner experience, our thoughts, our emotions, our body sensations, our impulses, but it can expand beyond that too. And then we're in the realm of relationship. We're in the realm of recognizing that what we see and hear, the conversations that we have, are kind of, as you said, like an interrelationship between the inner and the outer. And yet, of course, everything that happens around us is experienced through our consciousness, through awareness. So there's no real separation between what's happening around us and what's happening within us. They're all experienced through awareness. So if we recognize that, then we've got the possibility of a relationality that isn't kind of a separate you and a separate me. There's a kind of a field where kind of my awareness and your awareness kind of like is not separate. It's kind of like it's happening in that relational field. And if we can tap into that and recognize how we affect each other, we can, with our own intentions, we can cultivate relationships that are perhaps more likely to be healthy for each of us. We can hear each other. We can have communications. We can perhaps begin to understand what goes on within a different person in the same way that with attention and with mindfulness, we can understand what's going on within us. So the possibility becomes then that the kind of interrelationship that we're developing with mindfulness training and meditation, noticing, put it very simply, what's happening within us, can also apply to the world around us, to what's going on in the natural world, to other people, to the world as a whole. So it kind of like we can attend inwardly, but we can also attend outwardly, and we can recognize that there isn't a kind of a solid wall between the inner and the outer. There's kind of like as a kind of a flow of attention that can move in and move out, and that actually it's the same quality of attention, and it's the same awareness that holds all of what is happening. Does that make any sense? Sometimes, as you said at the beginning, it's sometimes difficult to describe this in words because it is experience. The words can only point to the experience, and I may not be using words as skillfully as I might, but and of course we all have different ideas about what the words mean. But I suppose what I'm kind of attempting to point to is the direct experience of paying attention and what shows up in awareness, and that this can be worked with in a way that could be beneficial for us and for those around us.
It feels so important and so deeply practical. And a major area of interest in my own life has been in the context of company building. And it's been quite an incredible experience. And it's taken some time to sink in. And I guess it'll continue to sink in for the rest. It's something one works on for the rest, or for an entire lifetime, I'd guess. But this experience, and very much as you've just said, the acknowledgement of the way we relate to ourselves is fundamental to the way we relate to the world. And I can't emphasize just how practical this is and how practical it can be, that any chance we have of building anything in the world of business or organizationally, organizing people, gathering people, that coming into attunement of our inner environment, it's the beginning. It's the beginning of many beautiful things. And so as part of this conversation, I feel such a strong calling to touch on how deeply practical the practices that you've cultivated, that you've deepened, how incredibly potent these practices are, if our objective is to relate to each other in more fruitful, more expansive, more enriching ways, in more, I think a word I love very much is coherent, in more relating to each other in more coherent ways. And the marketplace could use a bit more of that.
Well, the key in what you're saying here is this word practice. We can talk about this till the cows come home, and it would still be words. And so, if anyone is interested in cultivating this, then it's a bit like if you want to learn to play the piano, you could talk about playing the piano for a long time and not be able to play the piano. So I would see mindfulness training as the skill of learning to play the piano. When it comes to paying attention, when it comes to relating with experience consciously. And so, yes, absolutely. This can be brought to whatever it is that we're doing. Whether it's business, whether it's family, whether it's friendship. Whatever activity that we're engaged with. I mean, we bring our attention everywhere we go. So we train all in lots of other skills. Why not train in this one? Because it's actually foundational to how we live our lives. If we can train in paying attention, we can learn how to kind of manage, the kind of like the frenetic chimp, or the kind of like whatever our particular animal tends to do. If we can learn to hold that and manage that's going to affect everything. So it starts at home. Like I would suggest it starts with each of us to take the responsibility to train the faculty of paying attention. And then, yes, absolutely, this can then be brought into whatever it is, however it is we engage in the world. It's wonderful, Willie, that you're focused in the business world and bringing this into the business world where, it could be so valuable. And, perhaps where there's a lot of busyness and a lot of, striving and challenge and difficulty. And so, kind of bringing the quality of present-centered attention into that world could be so beneficial. But actually, what I love about kind of the work of meditation is that we can bring it to anything. It's kind of like because we bring our faculty of attention wherever we go, the way that we relate will be affected by that capacity. So if we're relating automatically, we'll do the things that we've always done. We'll be driven by our own mental models, whatever those are. We'll be likely driven by our emotional habits and our behavioral, or the behaviors that come perhaps from the emotions that we feel, the body sensations that we experience that might drive us. And just a little bit of learning to attend can make a big difference in the effect that we have in the world around us.
It seems to open the door to genuine creativity, that it feels in any domain that without that capacity for some kind of quietening of the inner monologue, recurring thought patterns, habits of thought, without the ability to turn the volume down on that or to relate to it in a more spacious way, it seems to be very hard to experience new things.
Yeah, well,
in life.
I would say it's more the allowing the spaciousness around kind of the noise rather than turning it down. And because as soon as you try to turn it down, it's like, actually what we discover is that, the dial on that particular radio is not, is not really working very well. So as soon as you try to turn it down, like you're getting into a state of struggle with it. And of course, the struggle is often what that kind of our automatic thoughts can lead us into. So if we're trying to turn them down, we're just kind of like creating more struggle. So maybe it's a bit like there's another dial. Actually, Stephen Hayes uses this metaphor. He talks about like the radio with two dials. One is the sort of like the trying to turn it down, trying to turn the noise down dial. He says there's another dial actually at the back, and that dial is the willingness dial. And so, or the acceptance dial. And if we can turn that dial up and be willing to experience the noise, then actually we've created a spaciousness. We've created a space in which we can perhaps tolerate the chatter in our minds without trying to fight it or get rid of it, which doesn't tend to work very well. But to allow the space for it, the space of willingness to say, yeah, okay, so I'm a human being. There's going to be automatic thoughts. There's going to be habit patterns of reactivity arising within me in various ways. But if I can be willing to experience that fully and openly, without being driven by it. So this isn't the same as kind of giving ourselves over to it, which is what happens when our attention automatically goes to it and is fused with it. fused with that stuff. So it's actually a conscious place of holding the experience of the automaticity. Then we've got space within that and around that to act in more skillful ways. So it's much more that sense of cultivating a relationship to the inner experience of willingness, of openness, of presence, of confidence, that it can be met in this spacious, present-centered way. And within that, choices can be made. So we can use the faculty of attention to say, yeah, all this is happening, and I can choose to attend to what needs to be attended to. So actually, well, I'll give you an example of this. Actually, right now, there are some things going on in my life that have created some anxiety at the moment. So I'm experiencing some of this at the moment. There's some kind of wobbly feelings in my tummy in relationship to what's going on. It's circumstances I can't do anything about right at the moment, and triggering some of that automaticity, which is kind of like an old friend of mine. It's like, oh, hello, here you are again. So there's some of those automatic thoughts. There's some of those sensations. My heart's beating a little quicker today than I would like it to, and yet at the same time, I'm employing the faculty of attention to have this conversation with you. And so just kind of like acknowledging that, yeah, okay, so it's here. And as best I can, my mind wanders, so every now and again, my mind's wandering into, kind of the thought about the situation that's going on, that's creating the anxiety. So mind wanders and I bring it back. And, bringing it back to you and to this conversation. And actually, interestingly, as this conversation has happened, I've noticed that actually my heartbeat's slowed down a little bit. It's calmed down, and the kind of like the thoughts about what's going on has kind of like dissipated somewhat. So the interesting thing is that when we don't try to make it different, but we focus our attention gently and carefully on what we want to actually do, actually following our intention, then actually sometimes the kind of like the automaticity of reactivity, whatever that is, whether that's anxiety or whether it's whatever our own sort of personal patterns are that tend to ensnare us, the kind of impulse to, I don't know, smoke or whatever it might happen to be, by paying attention in this way, it can sometimes the noise can dial down by itself. The key is that we don't try to make that happen, but sometimes it can.
Feels quite beautiful. I'm noticing the feelings in my body right now in recognizing that there are ways to bring about change in our lives that do not require forcing, uprooting, manipulating. That feels really interesting.
So often we're driven, aren't we? So often we're kind of like, we are programmed to relate to the world from a mode of mind that in mindfulness training is called, we sometimes call it the driven mode, and that mode works by identifying, by the thinking mind identifying where we want to get to, comparing that with where we are now, and then plotting the course to get to where we'd like to be. And it's a perfectly valid way of resolving problems. So that's why we've evolved this capacity, because for things like finding food or fixing a car or, kind of completing a project, kind of in business, it can be a really valid mode and very effective. But when it comes to our inner experience, something unfortunate can tend to happen when we employ that mode. So, for example, if I have the idea that I'd like to be happier, and I identify that state of happiness in my mind as a kind of a goal, then I compare it with where I am now. Oh, where am I now? Oh, not as happy as I'd like to be. And suddenly we've got a thought about the experience of not being happy enough. And we've got this image of what we'd like to be. And yet you can't plot your course to happiness in the same way that you could make a meal. You can't just kind of just do things to become happy. So having that kind of goal-based approach to these kinds of experiences tends not to help, because all that happens is that the mind judges the gap between the desire and the current experience. Well, what's the effect of that? Oh, that's not very nice. So we actually feel less happy by identifying the goal of happiness and then comparing it with where we are right now. And if we drive and say, well, if I can just get the best job, and if I can just get the best, kind of partner, and if I, we're kind of on a treadmill then of striving. This isn't to say that we shouldn't find a job that is fulfilling for us, or a partner that there's kind of mutual love and respect, etc. But it's more the manner that the driven mode of mind does this, is in like plotting them as goals to get to and therefore to push towards. And that pushing actually creating the unhappiness that is the opposite of what we want. So there's been some interesting studies coming from one of the Canadian universities that actually people who have happiness as a goal are much less likely to be happy than people who don't, but who give themselves right now in this moment to activities that are contentment generating activities for them, as in right now. Like not as a future goal, not as something to strive towards, but engaging with them in the present moment, kind of just, being with those moment by moment without the goal of them making us happy. And that is much more likely to lead to contentment by itself.
I'm reminded of an aphorism in a book called The Bed of Procrustes by Nassim Taleb. He writes, I went to a happiness conference. Very few people I met were happy.
Yeah.
Could you speak, Ed, about acceptance has come up a few times in the conversation. Could you speak to your experience of the importance of acceptance as part of a practice, as part of a journey, if one is seeking to improve the quality of one's capacity to attend? What role does acceptance play?
It's very important, because the human mind will, by default, tend to bring its drivenness to the process of mindfulness training, just like it does to the kind of desire for happiness. It's like, so, the thinking mind loves the idea that meditation can make us feel better. Like, great, I found something that's, this is the solution. I mean, I've, done this myself at times, and, kind of where we can kind of get into kind of a sort of competitive meditation, kind of like where we're trying, competing with ourselves to get there. Are we there yet? And that tends to be very unhelpful for the process of practice, because it just becomes another ideal. So this is meditation as an attempt to get calm or relaxed or enlightened or, or happy, and it's inevitable to some degree that this will show up, and it's okay that it shows up, just like any other thoughts or ideas or habit patterns that show up. So the way that we can work with that in meditation practice is to recognize it and include the experience in our awareness, in that sense of spacious presence that sees the tendency to strive, to struggle, to try to get results, to feel a certain way. and rather to kind of let go into allowing whatever our experience is in the moment. So in meditation practice, we come back to now, we come back to this breath, we come back to these sounds, we come back to awareness of these thoughts arising or these sensations arising. And in the awareness of what's arising, it can't be anything other than now. So therefore, it kind of can help to kind of unhook us from that kind of identification with the future-based goal, the kind of the ideal. So we notice that we'd like to be calm in meditation, and we say, oh, it's okay. It's okay to, want to be calm. But if we're identified with that wanting, then we've got a problem, because it's going to turn into a discrepancy between now and an imagined future of calm, and that's likely to make us feel stressed. So if we can kind of just acknowledge the desire, unhook from that desire, and let go into what's actually happening, whatever it happens to be, then it's possible to be. And in that being, the more that we practice that being, the more maybe we can find it becomes a way of being that we can tap into moment by moment. It's a bit like the kind of old Zen joke of the student going to the teacher and saying, how long will it take me to get enlightened? And the teacher says, 10 years. And the student says, what if I try really hard? And the teacher says, 20 years. So we're kind of, letting go of trying and dropping into allowing. So acceptance is really key. Of course, that doesn't mean that we can suddenly accept, like we might be working in a process of working into acceptance. So sometimes it might be accepting that we're not accepting.
Very much so. I love that you say that, in that I think it's whether it's my own experience or talking to others who've cultivated some of these practices or taken interest in them, it's the initial experiences can be quite intense in that first phase of attunement, where you realize, actually, wow, I treat myself pretty poorly. I do not accept myself. I am harsh to no end in the way I relate to myself. I mean, I think it's just incredibly common to speak to people today and to, pretty quickly, get to talking about how poorly we treat ourselves, and how often we hear people say, my God, if I coached other people in the way I coached myself, I wouldn't have any friends. So, yeah, I love what you're saying in recognizing that. Well, if I could ask you what really helps and what's helped you as you've been through that experience of and been involved in teaching so many others. And maybe there's something about compassion, loving kindness here as part of this beautiful topic of acceptance and the importance of acceptance as part of these practices, almost like a sort of a key. Because I do feel, and I've certainly struggled with this, is as you turn awareness inward and you just realize how much of a mess things are, how poorly you're treating oneself, that can be quite a frightening experience.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's true, isn't it? That kind of like sometimes our initial awareness of what goes on inside of us can be something of a shock. So you mentioned kindness or compassion. Kindness is another integral element of meditation practice, of actually realizing that this is what it is to be human. Everybody's working with this in some way, shape, or form. That it's okay to go gently. So, we don't necessarily have to dive in, to, intensive meditation practice. That could be another forcing. It might be just kind of dropping in for short periods, pauses, sort of gradually teaching ourselves that it's workable to lean into our experience, and then it can be held, and it can be held with kindness. And so, at least in my experience, it's a gradual process of coming to develop that kindness, that acceptance. And so we can kind of lean in, and then we can also sort of step back again. So we can take it really gently. And this is kind of one of the advantages perhaps of working with someone, mindfulness training, rather than, using an app or, just reading a book, which probably won't teach you very much at all, because it'll be words. But actually engaging with a teacher of some kind who can support you in that process and offer you suitable guidance and can help you with maybe some of the stuff that comes up, such as noticing all of that reactivity, all of that harshness, all of that, difficulty, and can help you gently and carefully to develop the capacity to lean into it and hold it with acceptance.
I can attest to that. In my own experience, there are so many resources out there, and there's so many ways. For many years, I feel like reading was a tool to avoid actually doing the practice. I'm not sure that's too uncommon, right? In being able to articulate all the ways, all the benefits of these incredible practices and all these lineages, and it really is a way to avoid actually sitting with myself. And I have to say that the power of working with a teacher who embodies kindness, embodies acceptance in their presence, in their lived presence. Yeah, it can be really, really powerful. And so I feel as we come to the concluding moments of this really deeply enjoyable conversation, Ed, where can people find you in this world? How can people track you down if they're curious about what we've spoken about?
Yeah, so probably the best way is through my website, which is edhalliwell.com. You can find out there about mindfulness training that I offer, one-to-one, and also some groups. And so, yeah, if you're interested, or this conversation sparks an interest, then I would love to hear from you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to our conversation today. For more resources on the subject of quality across the domains of business, investing, psychology and art, please visit our website, theartofquality.co.